Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Eruvin Samach Zayin. Today's daf is dedicated in honor of Sam Cohen, starting a year of shlichut in Germany. Wishing you only the best, and may we continue to strengthen each other and continue daf yomi. Also, thank you to our amazing teacher who constantly makes complicated sugiout comprehensive and relatable, Ben and Shai. Hope I live up to that today. Okay, these are complicated sugiout. So we're going to start. I'm going to go back a little bit just to review where we were up to as a kind of leading into today's daf. We ended the previous day with on Samachem Bet with this story of these Jews who were in an inn for Shabbat, and the Jew who owned the inn showed up on Shabbat, and also he lived there. So he basically forbade them. They didn't Eruv before Shabbat. When he came in, he basically canceled their Eruv because then their Eruv was no longer valid. Okay, somebody asked me why exactly this happens, that it gets canceled. I just assume because the non-Jew shows up on the scene. Now, at this point, he forbids them, which means that their Eruv is no longer useful. So at that point, their Eruv is canceled. Once their Eruv is canceled, we now have this issue, which is that now can they, number one, rent from him on Shabbat? Is that allowed? And once they rent from him on Shabbat, the question becomes, it still doesn't help them. They still need to do bitul reshut. Can they do bitul reshut on Shabbat? Can they relinquish their rights to the courtyard? So basically, or to each other. So basically, Rabbi Yochanan says, and as they did it, and then Rabbi Yochanan said after they asked him, and he said, no problem. It's fine that you did that. It works. You can rent, and then you can cancel your reshut. Then we said Shmuel doesn't agree. He thinks that one cannot do that. Okay, it wouldn't work. And then he brings three cases, remember? And then within his three cases, one of them related to this, and the other two related to this concept of one can't cancel from one courtyard to another. You can't relinquish your rights to people, one courtyard group in one courtyard can't relinquish their rights to people in another courtyard. And that was Shmuel, to which we had Abaye and Rav who had two different understandings. Abaye said this works in a case only when each one can carry in their own courtyard, and then we don't allow it because everyone has a way to do it. Remember, bitul reshut, relinquishing your rights, is just a type of heter that the rabbis came up with, a leniency that we can allow. We don't want to have people that can't carry from outside their house to their courtyard. People did that all the time. They didn't want to be stuck. So they allow it when there's a real need. They allow relinquishing rights, because relinquishing rights, some people were asking about it, and we're going to see it more in Samach Tet. So I'm not going to get into it so much now. We'll see it in the mission when we get there, but we're also in tomorrow's daf. But relinquishing rights is really a bit of a fictitious thing, because I'm still living in my house. It's just that I'm basically saying my house is a free-for-all. Everyone can come in and everyone can use my space as much as they want. So it's a leniency. So basically we're going to use the leniency when we really need to, but we're not going to use the leniency. And today we're going to see more about it. When exactly can we use this leniency and when can't we use it? So we're going to use it when there's a real need, but not when you can already carry in your own courtyard. We don't see a need between two chatzerot to allow it. However, Abai said, but when no one can carry because of the other, because there's an inner and an outer, we're going to allow it across the board. To that came Rav, and he said, no. Shmuel really thinks one cannot relinquish rights from one courtyard to another. The only case, I'll agree with you that there's some case in a pnimi and a chitzoni, an inner and an outer, where something will be allowed, where relinquishing will be allowed, but not the way you think. It's not that you can relinquish rights from one courtyard to the other, really. It's that, and this we'll reread this last case that starts our daf off. If the Eruv physically was in the inner courtyard, and one person from the outer courtyard forgot and didn't join the Eruv, so we have again those four houses, two inside, two outside. So the two inside made an Eruv with one in the outside, and it sat in the inner courtyard. And one guy in the outside, let's say number D, we'll call them A, B, C, and D. D did not join. Vadai pnimit muteret. So now the pnimit is going to be allowed, because what can they do? They can basically close the door. Remember, they can say to achtadasha mishtamsha. They say, listen, okay, let's go backtrack a little bit. Generally, the outer people go to the inner people walk through the outer courtyard to get out. The outer people don't usually use the inner courtyard. However, once they do an Eruv, basically they're saying this is all shared common space. At this point, they have rights It's not exactly the same as the inner ones and the outer, but it almost becomes the same. They're basically saying we have ownership rights to the inner courtyard also. So basically their presence and the fact that one of them now is not part of the Eruv forbids everybody. But if they close the door and, okay, now there's debate about this, but in our sugya, Rava thinks that if they close the door, then the outer person in the courtyard, since they actually didn't Eruv together, the person who didn't join would have to say, I'm relinquishing my rights. Okay, so he will relinquish his rights to the inner courtyard, but it's not the same as we've been talking about until now. It's not to relinquish rights to allow the inner courtyard to carry in the outer courtyard. It's relinquishing rights and just he's saying, listen, I'm going to have nothing to do with your space. So they close the door and that basically blocks everybody off and they relinquish their rights to the inner so that they say, we no longer, it's actually everybody in the outer courtyard will have to say, we no longer are going to have rights in your space. They're relinquishing their rights that they kind of gained through the Eruv. They're basically saying, we're not going to use those. But the chitzonah is obviously going to be forbidden because the inner people can still walk out if they want and get out through the outer. It's just that no one can come into the inner. And that's the only case where there could be some sort of bitul reshut. It's not the same as Abaye said. Abaye's bitul reshut was we can now all carry in our shared space. This is not the same kind of bitul reshut. So that's what Rav is coming to say about Shmuel. So Amalei Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua leRava. Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua now questions Rav on this. In the case where one of the inner people, remember, now this is the other case. The Eruv was in the inner. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, this is why it's critical. We've said before, well, the Eruv's not in their space. When we tried to say one could cancel to the other, we said, well, the Eruv's not there. Now you see why it's so critical the Eruv be there. Because if the Pnimi want to separate off from the Chitzoni, and they want to say, we're doing our own thing, well, if the Eruv isn't in their space, they can't do that, obviously. They can only do it if the Eruv sits there. Otherwise, they have no Eruv to rely on. If they're separating spaces, then obviously the Eruv that's in the other space isn't going to help them at all. So it only works if the Eruv is with them. Now, in the other case, where the Eruv is in the outer courtyard, and the Eruv is in the inner courtyard, this is the same. And one of the pnimit, though, forgot to join the Eruv, the lo irev, amai shtehena sugiout. Why don't we say the following? Libata bar pnimit libnei pnimit. Okay, so we had A, B, C, and D. Before it was D, who was in the outer courtyard, who didn't join the courtyard. Let's say this time it's A. A, who's in the inner courtyard, doesn't join. The Eruv is sitting in the inner courtyard. Why don't we say, Libata bar pnimit libnei pnimit. He relinquishes his rights to B. Okay, at this point, well, at this point, there's an Eruv between B, C, and D, which was before. A relinquishes rights to B, so B basically has rights to A's, which means basically, it's almost like the transitive property. We can view this as all one thing. And why don't we say this works? A doesn't actually need to relinquish his rights to C and D, just needs to relinquish it to B. As soon as he relinquishes it to B, B is already together with C and D, so all is good. So why don't you say that, Rava? So Rava says, Keman, who are you holding like that you're asking me this question? You must be holding like Rabbi Eliezer. Tahamal, now when it talks about bitul reshut, there's different opinions about how to do relinquishing your rights. Do you have to relinquish your rights to every single person in the courtyard or just to one person? So you, by asking this question, must be holding like Rabbi Eliezer. Tahamari no tzarich levatel reshut l'chol echad ve'echad, who says you don't have to relinquish your rights to every single person in the courtyard. Ki ka'amina, but I was talking l'Rabbanan. I think the relinquishing rights only works. This is again, how fictitious is this relinquishing rights and how far do you have to go? If you have to go to every single person, right, you're obviously going to take this relinquishing more seriously. You have to go to every single person and say, I give you rights to my chatzir. That's why Rava says, that's why Shmuel wouldn't obviously let this go, because you can't, remember, Shmuel says you can't relinquish rights, again, in Rava's understanding, ever to someone in a different courtyard. So since he would have to go to B, C, and D, he can't do it because he can't go to C and D. They're in a different courtyard. And that's why it doesn't work the way you asked the question. Now we get a bit of an intro. We're moving on a little bit. A bit of an intro, which is, you have to wonder why they're specifically telling you this. But here comes a little bit of an intro that we're going to learn a little bit about Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshet. Kipagu bahade adade, when they would meet, when they would get together, Rav Chisda martaan shifute mimatniata de Rav Sheshet, Rav Sheshet mirta kule gufe mi pulpile de Rav Chisda. Each one was scared when they were in the presence of the other. Rav Sheshet had huge breadth of knowledge. Often we call the Sinai no ker harim, right? The Sinai knows everything. Rav Sheshet knew everything. And therefore, Rav Chisda was scared that if he'd say something, Rav Sheshet would say, but there's a braita or a mishnah that says otherwise, and he would basically knock him out. And Rav Chisda was very sharp, and Rav Sheshet was scared always by, I think the word is better to say intimidated, by his ability to ask strong questions. And therefore, each one, this is a great example of everybody, you might have your own strengths, but often when you're in the presence of someone who has the strengths that are your weaknesses, right, you feel intimidated. So I don't know why particularly they're telling us this now, but now we're going to have a question that Rav Chisda asked Rav Sheshet. So, by mine Rav Chisda mi Rav Sheshet, shnei batim mishnei tzidei reshut harabim. Okay, let's say I live across the street from you, and I'll pull up the picture. 1 second. Okay, I'm across the street from you. 1 second. This didn't work. Okay, I live across the street from you, and there's a street in between both of us. Okay, so in between you and me is the public domain. So now, sorry, I'm just trying to pull up the picture. Okay, so now what happens? In the middle of Shabbat, Ba'u nochlim, okay, we're discussing situations where something changed on Shabbat. In the middle of Shabbat, Ba'u nochlim v'kifu mechitza b'Shabbat. So they came and put up this gate, the fence, in between our two houses, which means that now this is not a public thoroughfare in between our houses. It's now private. It's a reshut yachid. So now, again, from Torah law, we can carry from one to the other because this is all a reshut yachid. But by rabbinic law, we have to do an eruv in order to allow carrying from one to the other because it's a little bit like, right, there's space in between. So what do we say? Aliba demanda amal. Okay, so first, so he says, what's the situation? Now, we can't do an eruv at this point because it's Shabbat and one can't do an eruv on Shabbat. So can we do this bitul reshut? Can one relinquish rights to the other? In which case allow it. And this again goes back to when is relinquishing rights permitted? So he says like this. Aliba demanda amar. So now the reaction is, well, wait, in what case is your question? If you hold, okay, again, we're going to go back to Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. If you hold, ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer. If you hold like Shmuel, that one can't relinquish rights from courtyard to courtyard. Now, that's not the same case. Don't get confused. This is not courtyard to courtyard. This is house to house. But according to Shmuel, one can't relinquish rights from courtyard to courtyard. Lo tibailach. Then there's no question. It's obvious what the answer is. Why? Hashta, in the case of chatzer lechatzer, let's go with Abaye, okay, the more limiting option, which is that he meant two courtyards next to each other, right, that each open to the public domain. In that case, if they wanted to do an eruv before Shabbat, could they? Yes. If they want to do bitul reshut, can they? No. So what the Gemara is going to say, or Rav Sheshet is going to say, is you're obviously going to ask you a question according to that. Because why? If you wanted to do an eruv from yesterday, you could have. And yet, amart ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer, and yet you said, Shmuel said, you can't do relinquishing rights. So in this case, it's different. You couldn't have potentially done an eruv yesterday because yesterday the public domain went right through your space. So therefore, lo kol shekain, of course you're not going to be able to do an eruv, to do a bitul reshut in this case. What it basically means, and you have to figure out again, how does bitul reshut work? The classic case of bitul reshut is when we all did an eruv, and I should have joined your eruv, but I didn't. So again, there's potential to have done an eruv, but I didn't join your eruv. We allow me, right, on Shabbat to say, I relinquish my rights to my space, okay, in order to allow me to join the eruv that I should have joined yesterday, and I potentially could have joined. So comes Rav Sheshet, he says, your question obviously can't be this, because according to, if you say, ein bitul mechatzer lechatzer, bitul reshut, because if in a case where you could have potentially done an eruv, we don't allow it. Of course, if you couldn't have done an eruv yesterday, for sure we're not going to allow you on Shabbat to relinquish rights. And relinquishing rights is only to kind of fix a situation that you didn't do properly or you couldn't have done properly yesterday for whatever reason. But your question must be, your question must be according to Rabbi Yochanan, where he said one can relinquish rights from courtyard to courtyard. So now, what would you say? Here are the two sides of the question. Hatam, there. If they wanted to, the two courtyards could have made an eruv. They just didn't. And then comes Rabbi Yochanan and says, so then you're allowed to relinquish your rights. But maybe you might say here it doesn't work because since you couldn't have done it yesterday, you also can't relinquish you can't relinquish your rights. Okay, so again, would we say this? Or maybe relinquishing rights has nothing to do with could I have done an eruv yesterday? The fact that now that relinquishing rights is just a leniency that applies anytime you can't, you have a way to fix it. So what that yesterday it wasn't an option. Now it's an option. It's a default if you can't do eruv. In this case, it's Shabbat. You can't make an eruv on Shabbat. So we'll allow relinquishing of rights. Who cares whether yesterday it wasn't allowed or not? So that's the question. Do we say it only works if you could potentially have done an eruv yesterday? Or do we say it works no matter what? If you're stuck on Shabbat and you can't do an eruv, and theoretically you could if it weren't Shabbat, then we allow it. Okay, so now that's his question, and as Rav Sheshet explains the question of Rav Chisda. And what's his answer? He says, Amrle ein mevatlin. In fact, he says you can't relinquish rights, meaning there has to have been a potential, basically, according to Rav Sheshet, to have done an eruv from yesterday. If there was no potential to do an eruv yesterday, the fact that we have this new situation now doesn't allow relinquishing of rights. Next question of Rav Chisda. Meit nochri b'Shabbat mahu. This is kind of different now. This is a case where we live in a courtyard. All of us live in a courtyard with a Gentile. What happens? The Gentile's unwilling to make an eruv with us. So not to make an eruv, but to rent out his space to us. So we don't make an eruv because what's the point of making an eruv? It's a useless eruv. So we don't make an eruv before Shabbat. What happens? The nochri dies on Shabbat. So now there's actually no Gentile resident living in the courtyard anymore. So at this point, if it were not Shabbat, it's the same idea as the other case, but a little bit different. What's the difference here? The difference is we could have potentially made an eruv yesterday. Again, what does potentially mean? Potentially means we could have, because it was a space that you could have made an eruv as long as we got the nochri to rent the space to us. But he wouldn't, so we didn't. But theoretically, we could have. So now, what happens? So again, it's going to depend on what you hold, on a different machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel. Aliba demanda amar socharin. Remember the case of the inn that we started with today. There they said, number one, Rabbi Yochanan said, you can rent the space from the nochri, from the Gentile on Shabbat, and then you can relinquish your rights all to one of the Jews living there, and then you can all carry. So if you say socharin, like Rabbi Yochanan lo tibaylach, there's obviously no question here why. The way they view it is it's a numbers game. Hashta tarte avdinan. There, in the case of the inn, you did two things. We allowed, number one, to rent. Number two, to relinquish rights. Chada mibaya, you're going to ask now, can you just relinquish rights? In other words, of course, if we allow renting and relinquishing of rights in that case, of course, you can allow relinquishing of rights. But Shmuel, who said one can't rent, the question is, why did he think you can't rent? There, maybe he thought because he doesn't want to allow both renting and relinquishing of rights. But but here there's only one that needs doing. You only need to relinquish rights. Maybe he didn't want to rent, but he would have allowed just relinquishing rights. Or does it not make a difference? So Amarle, Rav Sheshet answers, Ani omer mevatlin, v'hamnuna amar e mevatlin. He basically says some machloket, but he himself says mevatlin. If we go compare this to his previous answer, in the previous case, he didn't allow it. In this case, he allowed it, and that seems to be clear because here you potentially could have done an eruv yesterday. It's just that the non-Jew was unwilling to be part of, to rent his space. But since there was a potential, Therefore, we're going to allow it on Shabbat. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, a different case now. Now we have, again, we're trying to, what you see here, again, I think is a very strong sense of, and we're going to see this definitely upcoming for what we're going to see right now, is that you start with the Mishnah, and this very often happens. You start with a Mishnah that seems to basically forbid. There's a non-Jew, a Gentile living with you. No can do, right? You're stuck. All because we want to discourage you. The Gemara comes up with lots and lots of situations where you can rent from them. Today we're going to see that maybe you don't even have to rent in certain cases. We can come up with all these leniencies. And again, probably because, as we said, things changed and it was much more common that Jews were living among Gentiles and they had better relationships and they weren't as concerned for all the concerns. So therefore, they tried to come up with possibilities. So now we're going to look at the next picture here. Okay, picture number 236. So for this picture, we have a house of a Gentile in a courtyard. There's another house of a Jew in another courtyard, and they both exit to the same mavoy. Okay, this is their alleyway, their shared alleyway. So normally you would say, if they want to carry in the alleyway, they would have to rent the space of the Gentile. What does it say here? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, we're 2 dots, about 7 lines from the bottom. Nochri sheyesh lo petach arba'a al arba'a patuach libika. I don't know if you noticed this, but in the back of the Gentile's house, there's an exit to a big space, a big wide open space. So how big an opening? A very small opening, 4 by 4 handbreadths. We're not talking about a big opening. It's a small opening. That is enough of an opening. Okay, now look, you can see the picture. There's all these camels going in and out of the mavoy into, right from the alley into the Gentile's house. It says here, Afilu machnisu motzi gmalim ukronot kol ayom kulo. Even if animals are passing through and other things he's bringing in and out through that shared alley, derech mavoy, ein oser al bnei mavoy. He doesn't forbid the people in the alley. There's a crazy heter. My taima. So we basically say that since the Gentile has this exit, even though he's using the exit by the alley, we still say that we're going to basically say he has his own special exit. He'd rather use that than the one that's for everybody. That's our basic assumption here. Okay, so which is really interesting because you see in the picture, I'll pull it up again. You see in the picture that he's using the exit to the alley, okay, that we share. But we're going to basically say that he's using the side, since the side one is his own private exit to the outside world, we're going to say, let's assume, this is why I say it's a huge leniency. That's his exit, in which case we're basically going to say the mavoy is not his. If the mavoy is not his, well then we can all carry in the mavoy. We don't need to rent the Gentile space. So now we're going to lead from here to a question about a karpaf. And from here, we're going to get all back to our laws about karpaf and carrying in a karpaf and all those things. So it'll be a good review of the whole issue of karpaf. If you don't remember what a karpaf is, I'll explain. It's a place that's surrounded for the purposes, it's surrounded with a wall. So it's kind of like a private domain. However, it's not surrounded by a wall for purposes of living. It's usually for storage or something like that. And because of that, depending on its size, whether it's either beit sa'atayim or less, or more than beit sa'atayim, we're basically going to determine whether we view it as a reshut yachid, a private domain, or whether we call it a carmelit. Once it's big, we're going to call it a carmelit. And then we're going to say, right, there's a few issues about a carmelit. So the main thing being, you can't carry more than 4 cubits in it because the rabbis are stringent and view it like a reshut rabim to a certain, like a private domain to a certain extent. But first, we're going to talk just in general. We're going to use the karpaf. We're not going to get into that just yet. Let's say it's open instead of to this big, wide open space in the back of the Nochri's courtyard, the Gentiles' courtyard, it's patuach lekarpaf. So they asked the following question, patuach lekarpaf mal. What if it goes into this? Now, the Ritva says it must be that we mean it goes into this enclosed space, the backyard of his house, but it doesn't necessarily mean to be the back. It just could be the back, could be any, right? As long as he has an entrance there. But that there must be some exit from that karpaf, there must be an opening at the other side of the karpaf to get out to the outside world. Okay, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. If it just goes into a closed space, that's not going to obviously be relevant. But what if it opens? The main thing being, it's not open into a wide, big space. It opens up into a narrow space, a smaller enclosed space, but that one could get out through there. Are we still going to say that the nochri, the Gentile, would rather use that space? So mahu. Amar Rav Nachman bar Ami mishmei de ulpana, says in the name of ulpana, which Rashi says means in the name of tradition. I learned from my rabbi, I learned from his rabbi, I learned from his rabbi. Afilu patuach lekarpaf, even if it's open into this karpaf. Rabbi Rav Yosef to Amri Travayu. Well, he now says, wait a minute. It depends how big the karpaf is. Nochri, and now we're going to go to our classic difference between a beit sa'atayim and bigger than beit sa'atayim. Nochri, beit sa'atayim asur. If we're talking about the nochri, non-Jew, the Gentiles' house, opens up into this karpaf, depends on the size. If it's small, like a beit sa'atayim or smaller, oser, then we're going to say no. Of course, he's not going to use that space. It's like you don't want to open up into a small space. You're not going to go out there. You'd rather open up into big, wide space. So he's going to end up using the mavoy, which means he's going to be considered part of our courtyard and forbid us. But yotermi beit, again, unless we rent his space. Yotermi beit sa'atayim may no oser. But if it's bigger than a beit sa'atayim, then already it's going to feel, right? This is in terms of feeling like we have a lot of space, right? You'll walk out into that big open space. Big closed-in space. Remember, it's closed, but I'll walk out of my house that way because it's very large. But then they say something interesting. If it's a Jew, it's the exact opposite. What would be the case of a Jew? Meaning, if we're all part of one courtyard, I don't join the Eruv. I'm the only one who didn't join the Eruv. And I have this exit in the back of my house that goes into a karpaf, or again, it could be anywhere out of my house, just not only, I have one side that goes out to the alley and one side that goes there. Can we assume that I'm not connected with you because I'll use my own private exit more likely? So there we're going to say it's the exact opposite. And I'll explain why in a minute. There's a few different explanations of this line, but Yisrael beit sa'atayim eino osel, yotermi beit sa'atayim osel. It's the exact opposite. Why? Because on Shabbat, what did I just tell you about a karpaf? If it's more than beit sa'atayim, I can't carry more than 4 amot in that space. If that's the case, it's unlikely I'm going to want to leave into that large space on Shabbat. The whole issue is, am I going to use that space on Shabbat or not? Am I part of your courtyard or not? So if it's a huge space that I can't carry in according to rabbinic law, I'm not going to want to go into that space. But if it's a smaller space, I'll likely use it more. And then theoretically, I might go out of my house that way. But if it's a space that I can't carry in, then I'm not going to really want to use it. So it becomes the exact opposite. Now we're going to have the exact same question that we asked before. Rava bar Chaklai me Rav Huna, patuach lekarpaf, and here we're talking about a Gentile. The Gentile's house is open to a karpaf mao, and he's going to say the exact same thing. It's just showing somebody else said the same thing. Okay, I don't know why they repeated this, but it's the exact same thing. Now we're going to move into, as I said, laws of carrying, and this part is a little bit more complicated. Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Karpaf yotermi beit satayim shalohu kaf ledira. Okay, this is something we know. A karpaf, this goes back to laws of carrying. If the karpaf is more than beit satayim and it's not walled in for the purposes of living purposes, vafilu kor, afilu kulayim, even if it's huge, hazorek letocho chayav. If you throw from the public domain into this space. Now, what did we say? We treat this space like a carmelit. But Rabbi Yochanan says, only to be stringent, we treat it like a carmelit. What does it mean? If I say this is a carmelit, we just said, I can't carry more than 4 amot. If it's a private domain, I can carry in any private domain as much as I want. My own house, there's no eruv, I can carry in my own house. That's not a problem. So here they say, comes Rabbi Yochanan and he says, or Ula says in his name, if you throw from the public domain into this private domain, you're chayav. My taima machitzahi, because it has a wall around it. That means it's a reshutei achid. It has its minimum size for sure, reshutei achid, and now it's also got this issue, right? It's basically, it has walls. Why do we call it a carmelit that one can't carry 4 amot inside? Because nobody lives there. So we're going to be stringent and call it a carmelit, but we're not going to be lenient. If we were lenient, if we said it's a carmelit through and through, then what will we say? Number one, you can't carry more than 4 amot inside. Number two, though, if you throw something from the public into the carmelit, it's forbidden only by rabbinic law. It's not forbidden by Torah law. Comes Rabbi Yochanan, he says, no. For Torah law purposes, right, this is a reshut yachid by Torah law. So therefore, if you throw from reshut rabim into here, even though it's huge and we call it a carmelit, it's still a reshut yachid for purposes of transferring from domain to domain. Okay, that's a big important law, and we're going to have a big question on this law. Okay, Mativ Rav Huna bar Chinina. Sela shabayam gavoa asara verochav arba'a. If you have a rock in the middle of the water that is 10 tvachim tall, 4 by 4 wide. Now remember, this is a classic reshut hayachid. Now I see, Tova, you're asking all because of the walls. It's because of the walls, but in this case, the rock itself, we're going to say that the outer part of the rock creates walls. Okay, there's no actual physical walls here. We have a rock in the middle of the water. Even without walls, it's going to be as if it has walls because we basically view the sides as if they're walls. So now, this is classic reshut hayachid. It's 10 tall, 4 by 4 wide. This we've seen many times. So therefore, we basically have a reshut hayachid that is situated where? In the middle of the water. Water is classified as a carmelit because it's kind of public, but it's not public like the like a reshut rabim, and therefore we call it a carmelit. So the previous case, that's what the Gemara said, Tova, about the mechitza, that it has a wall around it. So yes, it's because it has walls. If it didn't have walls, it wouldn't be a reshut hayachid, only because it has walls. So now, Sela shabayam gavoa asara v'rochav arba'a emet taltalim lo min tocho layam v'lo min hayam letocho. Right, this is all rabbinic law because, right, one can't carry from the water to the rock because it's carmelit to reshut hayachid, from reshut hayachid to carmelit. That's forbidden by rabbinic law. Pachot, we have, remember, carmelit is all rabbinic in nature. The only thing doraita is public to private. This is not public to private. This is carmelit to private. Carmelit is kind of anything that's in between reshut hayachid and reshut rabim. Okay, so now, ad kama, pachot mikan, but if the sela is smaller than that, then it's not, then what do we call it? I actually, as I said it, I was thinking it's not exactly true that it's in between. It's basically anything. There, you have reshut hayachid, reshut rabim, and then we have a makom p'tor, which has very specific definitions in exam space. Anything that's not one of those three is a carmelit. It could be any direction. So in this case, we're going to say if the rock is smaller than that and it's not the size of a makom p'tor, then we're going to say, right, then mitaltlin. The truth is, even if it's a makom p'tor, it could be either a carmelit or a makom p'tor. At that point, one can carry from carmelit to carmelit, as long as what? As long as you don't move it more than 4 amot, right? That's a problem. But from one carmelit to another carmelit, if you're not moving it 4 amot, 4 cubits, it's allowed, right? Theoretically, you could be standing right in the rock, want to go into the water, right there, you're allowed to do that because it's the same, it's considered the same. It's not forbidden to move from carmelit to carmelit. Now we have the third line here. And the question is, does the third line, this line I'm going to read right now, relate to what we just said? If it's not that big, then mitaltalin. Or does it relate to the first line about when it's a reshut hayachid and we're forbidden? So we're now going to read the last line of this braita. Ad kama, how big, until what size? Ad beit sa'atayim. So, ahaya. So what is this line referring? I didn't explain it because we don't yet know what it means. Ilema a seifa, if it's talking about the seifa, beit sa'atayim, tfei lo, v'hami karmelit la-karmelit kamitaltal. It shouldn't matter if it's ad beit sa'atayim. It doesn't matter the size. Even if it's more than beit sa'atayim, we call that a carmelit. And then again, carmelit to carmelit is allowed. So it can't possibly be referring to the seifa. Elalav a resha. It must be referring to the resha. And then what is it coming to say? And this is going to contradict Rabbi Yochanan. Hachi kamar. Sela shabayam. Gavoa asara. V'rachav arba'a. Ein metaltalin lo min tocholayam. V'lo min hayam letocho. V'ad kama. Ad beit sa'atayim. Right now we have to read it if it's referring to the first line. So if that's the case, we're going to say, if you have this sela, 10 tefachim tall, 4 by 4 wide, one can't carry from here to the carmelit, from the carmelit to there. That's as long as the rock is less than beit sa'atayim or beit sa'atayim. But ha yeter mi beit sa'atayim mitaltalim. But once that rock is larger than beit sa'atayim, then of course one can carry alma carmeliti. Therefore, it must be a carmelit. Now, this is a tiyuvta to Rabbi Yochanan, because what did Rabbi Yochanan say? When it comes to, can you carry within this space for amo, we're going to treat it like a carmelit. But when it comes to transferring items from Rishut Rabim to this carmelit, this karpaf, let's call it, we're going to still treat it as a Rishut Yachid and say that's forbidden by Torah law. So here we say no. When it comes to transferring from domain to domain, when it's more than a beit sa'atayim, we're going to say it's still a Rishut Yachid for those purposes. It's not a Rishut Yachid. Rabbi Yochanan said it's still a Rishut Yachid for carrying between domains. And this says, if it's not beit sa'atayim, then one can carry from carmelit to carmelit, because we call it a carmelit through and through. It's 100% a carmelit. Rabbi Yochanan didn't want to say it's 100% a carmelit. It's a carmelit for stringency purposes. One can carry 4 cubits. But when it comes to carrying from one domain to another, it's still considered Rishut Yachid. Okay? So now we have to resolve it. 2 answers. So they say, I'm a carmelit through and through, which means it's a sugiout to Rabbi Yochanan, who wanted to treat it part as a carmelit, part as Rishut Yachid. Okay, I'm a Rava. Mandelo yada terutza matniata tiyuvta motiv leila Rabbi Yochanan. Someone who doesn't know how to read braita, he brings a question to Rabbi Yochanan. This is like an intro of, what are you talking about? What a crazy question. Okay, now it's a little bit weird. He says this because he really is going to read it not according to its simple reading. La'olam aresha. You said it right, that line, if it's beit sa'atayim, right, that's all about referring to the first line. But hachi kamar. In the first line, ha bitocho metaltalim. It's really referring to not what it said in the first line, but an inference from the first line. The first line was talking about carrying from domain to domain, and that's why we have a problem. Because if it's bigger, it sounds like one can carry from domain to domain. Carmelit, not Rishut Yachid. But he says here, ha bitocho metaltalim. The inference from the first is that this rock, which is 10 high, 4 by 4 is a Rishut Yachid, and one can carry inside of it, right? One can carry in that space, which means that it's not, right? It's a Rishut Yachid. One can carry it there. Ve'ad kama, to what extent do we allow you to carry within that space more than 4 cubits? Ad beit sa'atayim. Once it's more than beit sa'atayim, we're going to be stringent when it comes to laws of carrying within that space. But when it comes to carrying from domain to domain, we're also going to be stringent, and we're going to still treat it like a Rishut Yachid, and one can't carry from the rock to the water, even though it's the biggest size that is a carmelit, it's still considered Rishut Yachid for purposes of transferring between Rishuyot, and then it matches Rabbi Yochanan perfectly. Not exactly the pshat, the simple reading, but it matches Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Ashi gives a different answer. He says, Le'olam aresha. But hein amru ve'hein amru. This is a very interesting line. This means the rabbi said this and the rabbi said that, meaning the rabbis made two laws here. But when they come in conflict with each other and there's an issue, they're going to basically ignore one of them. Okay? And basically, I want to explain this because it's very complicated. What he's really trying to say is that look at Rabbi Yochanan's case. Rabbi Yochanan's case was public domain to this karpaf, which we're going to treat by Torah law as a private domain. Now that's all on rabbinic, on Torah level, because his case was a public domain, which is going to be, if we call this karpaf still a Rishut Yachid, that's going to be a Torah law of moving from private to public to private. But our case is all about a carmelit. We want to know, can you move from the water, which is only a carmelit and only rabbinic in nature? So you're basically comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing Doraita level to Rabbanan level. When it comes to Rabbanan level, things are going to be different. Okay? And this is what he says. Hein amru ve'hein amru. Hein amru karpaf yeter mi beit sa'atayim shelo kaf l'dirayim metaltalim. That was all a rabbinic ordinance. They said, if you have this space that's more than a beit sa'atayim, which isn't, it has a mechitza, but not for the purposes of living, one cannot carry within that space. Ela b'dal adamo. We're going to treat it stringently like a public domain. Hein amru also ein metaltalim mi Rishut Yachid the carmelit. They're the ones who also forbade carrying from a private domain to a carmelit, because remember, by Torah law, it's only to a public domain. So, because they made these two ordinances, let's see how they work out, and maybe you're going to end up with an issue somehow. Beit sa'atayim deshar litzultule bekule. When you have a beit sa'atayim, which means it's beit sa'atayim or less, it's Rishut Yachid. We can carry within the space. It's like your own private house. Asrei rabbanan litzultule, right? Lo min hayam litochova, lo mitochol hayam. Then the rabbi said, okay, this is a Rishut Yachid. Therefore, we're going to forbid moving any items from the carmelit to the Rishut Yachid. Okay, that's just simply my taima, because rishut yachid gemurihi, because we're going to treat it like a rishut yachid 100%. Both, again, means two things. You can carry within that space, and it's forbidden to carry to some other domain, like a carmelit. But yet, once it's more than a beit time, we're going to have a problem. If you want to say like Rabbi Yochanan, who said in Torah law, we're going to treat it like a rishut yachid for passing back and forth, since what's the problem? The problem is, I'll tell it to you before we read it inside. The problem is, if I say it's forbidden for me to carry from the carmelit to here and from here to the carmelit, then people will think it's a rishut yachid. If people think it's a rishut yachid, they'll think I could carry in the space. And then people are going to end up carrying more than 4 amot, and that's not allowed here because the carmelit in that sense. Remember, we're splitting it. It's a carmelit for carrying within, and it's a rishut yachid for carrying from space to space. So therefore, they said, we don't want people to think that you could carry within, so therefore we're going to treat it like a carmelit so that people don't think it's a rishut yachid. So that's it. Since these are all rabbinic ordinances, they could play with it. So he says here, since you can't carry within this space, they basically uprooted the other rabbinic ordinance and said one can carry in this case from the carmelit to rishut yachid and rishut yachid to the carmelit. I'm sorry, from this space, which we're going to say we'll treat it as a carmelit, even though if it was doraita, Torah law, and it was a public domain, we wouldn't allow it. But here we're going to allow it to a carmelit. My taima dilma amri. People might say rishut yachid gemuri. They'll think it's a private domain. Ve'ate little tule bekule, and they'll come to carry in the whole space. Now the big question, and we'll end with this: Maishna tocho, right? Oh, Maishna. What's the difference? Why uproot one rabbinic ordinance for another one? Why don't we say the reverse? Okay, why specifically were they worried more that people would come to carry more than 4 amot? So they say very simply, tocho shachiach, mitocho layam u'minayam tocho lo shachiach. It's more common that someone might be on this rock and want to carry within it than the case where someone might be trying to transfer from domain to domain. And that's why Rav Ashi basically says they uproot that rabbinic ordinance for that, in which case it doesn't contradict Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan wasn't talking about a case of a carmelit. He was talking about a Torah law case, where it was private domain, public domain to private domain. There, we basically call a karpaf a private domain for purposes of carrying from one to the other. It's forbidden. Even though you can't carry more than 4 amot within it, it's not a rishut yachid for that. But when it comes to rabbinic, then we can play around with it because it's all rabbinic ordinances, and they could say, well, we see reason, right? Once we do that, people might think that you can carry within it, and they don't want that. So we're going to stop here. We'll pick up with the last part, which isn't connected to any of this, in tomorrow's class.